The year of her forced wedding was the wettest summer Alabama had seen in years, when the air hung heavy with heat and judgment, and the pecan trees dripped with the weight of storms that never cooled the earth. Eliza had been told she was lucky, that many women in her position never had a ceremony at all, that being chosen as a house bride meant a future with cleaner linens and softer hands, not the rough life of field women whose backs hardened under the whip, and whose names were often forgotten before harvest came. They said she would live near silk curtains, polished floors, and china clinking like tiny bones in the dining room, and the mistress insisted she smile because the mistress believed herself benevolent, arranging futures and controlling fates like God's clerk. But Eliza knew better. She knew a bride born in chains was not a bride at all, but an ornament placed where it pleased others, a symbol not of love, but of ownership. Like the silver hairbrushes on the vanity she was never allowed to touch even though she polished them each morning. She had watched other women become plantation wives to men they did not choose, forced into the illusion of union so the planter class could claim order, where there was only violence and obedience. And she wondered if her face betrayed her dread when the mistress spoke of the honor bestowed upon her. Honor was a word that tasted of iron and smoke in her mouth. She had seen honor used to justify chains, honor used to defend cruelty, honor used to explain away screams late at night when the master walked the halls with whiskey and rage clinging to him like a second skin. The house she lived in was a monument to moral theater, grand columns and perfect symmetry masking rot at its core, a rot that spread through bedrooms and nursery rooms and the small locked room behind the stairs where punishments were given in quiet so visitors wouldn't hear. Eliza understood she was being positioned not as a wife but as a possession, a gesture toward civility, proof that even brutal men could pretend at gentility by arranging structured union among those they held captive. On the eve of the ceremony, she stood barefoot on the back gallery, looking out across the rows of cotton stretching like a white sea, and the voices of families in the slave quarters rose like a low hymn carried by the damp air. Those voices steadied her, reminding her she belonged to a people who held on to life not because they were permitted dignity, but because they carved dignity out of every wound. Her mother had once whispered that resistance took many shapes: silence when they demanded song, memory when they demanded forgetting, and sometimes fire, because flames did not respect walls or titles or inheritance. Eliza had been 13 when she heard that, old enough to understand the weight of ashes and young enough to hope they would not one day stain her hands. Yet as she stood on the balcony as a young woman, breath thick with humidity, and the smell of molasses from the boiling shed, she sensed something simmering inside her, a slow burn that had been waiting for a spark. Her betrothed was a man named Thomas, chosen not by affection but by instruction, a skilled carpenter owned by the same plantation, a quiet man whose eyes held the shadow of someone who had seen enough suffering to avoid dreaming. They had spoken only in fragments, glances exchanged in doorways, nods in passing when work allowed, and she wondered if he resented the arrangement as much as she feared it. He never touched her beyond what the ceremony required in rehearsals, never imposed upon her the way others expected he might, once they were declared man and wife by plantation law, and in those rare moments when she saw him look away quickly, she thought she glimpsed pity in his expression or perhaps shame. But pity was not love and shame did not protect. He too was bound, and their wedding was simply another mechanism of control in a world where human connection was regulated like livestock breeding, where even a moment of comfort could be transformed into a tool of domination. In the days leading to the union, white women on the plantation pitied her loudly in parlors while envying her quietly in powder rooms, whispering about her composure, her skin, her beauty in a tone that mixed fascination and venom. Their faces were powdered to hide freckled evidence of sun, their corsets drawn tight until their ribs ached. Yet they judged the enslaved for daring to carry dignity without permission. They did not speak of their own captivity inside socially enforced silence, nor of the rage they hid behind lace gloves and virtue sermons, and they certainly did not speak of how many turned their eyes away when their husbands walked toward the cabins at night. They performed morality the way one performs a waltz, perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect lie, and to them Eliza was a spectacle, a servant stepping briefly onto the stage of their rituals. Her mother watched everything quietly, folding linens with hands scarred from years of labor, eyes steady but rimmed with grief. She had lived long enough to witness generations rise and fall under the weight of bondage, and knew the bitter truth that weddings in this world did not promise sanctuary, but risk. because any bond formed among the enslaved was a vulnerability the powerful could exploit. Yet she also knew that dignity sometimes survived in forbidden vows, in whispered promises exchanged beneath pine trees, in families held together by courage rather than law. On the night before the ceremony, she brushed Eliza's hair slowly, each stroke a prayer, and though no words were spoken, the silence between them carried centuries of mothers who had prepared daughters for futures they could not control, but would strive to survive nonetheless. When dawn came, it arrived soft and pink over the horizon, lighting the dew on the cotton fields like scattered pearls, and the big house stirred with activity. Lace was laid out, ribbons matched, chairs arranged beneath the oak where generations of enslaved had been bought and sold. The same tree that had witnessed auctions now served as a stage for a union, meant to prove plantation civility. The hypocrisy clung thicker than the Spanish moss. Eliza's dress was white muslin borrowed from the mistress's cousin, pinned and altered hastily to fit her, and as she stood in front of the mirror she did not see a bride. She saw a vessel being prepared for display, a body draped in borrowed virtue, yet beneath the fabric her pulse beat steady and strong, a reminder she was still alive, still thinking, still capable of shaping her fate, however dangerous that thought might be. Ceremonial words were spoken, vows exchanged under the oak's heavy branches, and polite applause rippled through the gathering. Thomas's hand brushed hers briefly, tentative, respectful, almost apologetic, and she inhaled deeply, not because the moment stirred affection, but because she knew breathing would become more difficult with each passing day. The overseer watched with arms crossed, calculating futures in the way one considers crops or livestock, and the mistress dabbed her eyes as though she had achieved something noble, never acknowledging that nobility cannot grow in soil watered by oppression. As Eliza stood there, the smell of smoke drifted from the direction of the sugar house where cane was boiled down. Sweet at first, then bitter as the heat rose, and she wondered if her life, too, would burn slowly until all sweetness was gone. Later that night, as guests retired and the house settled into its nocturnal hush, she sat by the small window of her assigned room, watching fireflies sparkle above the fields and listening to frogs call from the marsh. The quiet pressed against her like a question. Marriage in chains was not marriage. It was a performance meant to demonstrate order to those who feared rebellion. The plantation relied on ritual, Sunday sermons, harvest feasts, legal contracts, vows spoken beneath trees, to mask its violence with ceremony. But ceremony could not erase truth. She thought of the stories whispered in the quarters about women who had resisted in ways large and small, those who had run, those who had fought, those who had hidden children from sale, and those who had lit fires in cotton barns when nights grew too heavy. Fire was not madness. It was testimony, a way to remind the land that it did not belong to men who claimed dominion through cruelty. As the candle flickered low, she pressed her palm against the window glass and felt the night air seep through the edges, cool against her skin. Somewhere beyond the fields thunder rumbled, the promise of another storm, perhaps the kind that split trees and tore roofs from barns. And she wondered if nature ever whispered rebellion to itself, tired of holding back. She had entered this union without choice, but she had not surrendered her mind or her will. The ceremony had ended, but her story had not. And in the depths of her chest, beneath fear and resignation, there stirred a quiet certainty as fierce as lightning waiting in a cloud. If silence was survival in one season, fire could be survival in the next. Could be survival in the next. The storm carried through the night, rain tapping the roof like restless fingers and wind rattling shutters that had held through many seasons of fury, as if nature itself was pacing outside, unable to rest beneath the weight of what lay ahead. Eliza woke before dawn, not because she wished to rise, but because sleep had only visited her in fragments, drifting in and out like a nervous guest. She felt the heaviness of the previous day still clinging to her skin, an invisible film made of promises she had not spoken and futures she did not accept. In the dim light, she sat upright and listened to the breathing of the house, floorboards expanding in the humidity, distant footsteps of servants preparing morning tasks, the faint creak of the master's chambers as he moved about, always first to wake when power depended on being seen before others. Her new husband, assigned to a different quarters room until permissions changed, was already gone to work. The absence both a relief and a reminder that nothing in her life belonged to her, not even proximity, not even silence, not even time. Outside, the fields glistened with dew and the morning mist clung to the low ground like a shroud, as if the land itself mourned something it could not name. Eliza wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked carefully through the back corridor to begin her assigned duties. Ceremony had ended, but labor did not pause for sentiment. The mistress greeted her in the parlor with an air of satisfied benevolence, as though arranging this union had elevated her soul. She spoke softly about womanly virtues and household harmony, words that floated like dust motes in the sunbeams cutting through the windows, and Eliza nodded politely, her posture still, her eyes lowered in practiced restraint. The mistress believed she was educating, shaping, refining, but Eliza felt only the tightening of invisible cords, each phrase a thread pulling her deeper into the tapestry of ownership. As she polished brass fixtures and straightened lace doilies, the voices of the white women from the previous day echoed in her memory, their high-pitched excitement lined with envy and righteousness. They had admired the spectacle of her wedding as though it were a charming novelty, a talking point for their parlors, a demonstration of order under God's plan. Yet none had considered the burden such order placed upon those bound inside it. They sipped tea and spoke of morality, while the world they inhabited thrived on unspoken terror. And Eliza understood that their silence was not ignorance but complicity. They preferred a world where suffering could be wrapped in silk, where pain hid behind etiquette, where human ownership could be softened by rituals and pretty lies. But she also sensed something brittle beneath their composure, a fear that if one thread of their world were pulled loose, the entire structure might collapse. Later in the morning, she carried linens past the dining room where the master sat reading newspapers from Montgomery and Mobile, scanning political updates about cotton prices, slave patrol funding, and debates over expansion into new territories. The language was polite but ominous, each printed line braced by the conviction that their world was permanent, ordained, and righteous. He looked up briefly as she passed, his gaze sharp, measuring, a man accustomed to cataloging worth with a glance. Eliza kept her face neutral, though she felt her stomach tighten. Even without words, the threat of power permeated the room like heat from a forge. He returned his attention to the paper, never imagining that the woman before him thought of fire as more than destruction. It was restoration, purification, truth given visible shape. Outside the big house, the plantation stirred into its daily rhythm. Children in the quarters cried as mothers prepared them for chores or hid them in shadows to avoid the overseer's notice. Field workers gathered their tools under the watch of armed patrols, their movements slow not from laziness but exhaustion carved into bone by years of demand. The smell of corn mush cooking drifted through morning air, mingling with the metallic tang of wet earth and manure. Eliza paused at the back steps, watching the world she was born into move like machinery built to crush hope unless guarded fiercely. She saw faces she knew well, Ruth with her steady resolve, little Jonah always humming under his breath, old Moses who carried scars across his shoulders that mapped 3 decades of endurance. Their eyes met hers, some offering brief glimmers of solidarity, others burdened by too many memories to risk hope. In their looks she found grounding, a reminder that her story was not isolated. It was woven into a collective fabric that reached beyond fences and seasons and marriages imposed. Her first task outdoors that morning was to bring water to the laundry shed, a long wooden structure where steam billowed like breath in winter, and women labored endlessly over boiling tubs. As she filled buckets at the well, she overheard fragments of conversation, worries about a rumored sale, quiet excitement about a birth, fear whispered about a punishment that had taken place in the night on another plantation downriver. News traveled through enslaved communities like wind through cane fields, quiet but constant, spreading warnings and hopes alike. When she entered the laundry shed, the heat struck her immediately, thick and damp, and Lydia, an older woman with a voice rough from years of smoke and soap lye, handed her a bundle of clothing without ceremony. Lydia's eyes flicked briefly toward Eliza's midsection, assessing without judgment a silent question about whether her union came with expectation from the master or protection from harm. Eliza did not answer. Some truths were too heavy to speak aloud, especially when walls had ears. By midday, the sun burned through the morning coolness and the air shimmered over the fields. Eliza returned to the house to assist with meal preparations, slicing vegetables and stirring broth while listening to whispered criticisms of guests from the wedding. The cook, Aunt Hester, moved with practiced authority, commanding pots and people alike, her presence a force carved through decades of survival. She spoke little that day, but when she finally paused long enough to look directly at Eliza, her gaze was deep with knowledge. Without speaking, she placed a hand on Eliza's wrist for a moment, a silent blessing or warning, perhaps both. Then she continued her work as though nothing had happened, but the touch lingered like the memory of a hymn sung under breath during a funeral. As afternoon darkened into evening, Thomas returned from the carpentry shed, his shirt damp with sweat and sawdust clinging to his arms. He did not approach her directly. Instead, he waited in the yard, his posture tense, unsure whether to speak or walk away. Their union was a cage built for two, and both felt the confinement even if neither had chosen it. When their eyes finally met, he offered a nod that was not affection but acknowledgement, two prisoners recognizing each other in passing. She lowered her gaze and continued her steps not because she feared him, but because she feared being seen by those who monitored every gesture. Their connection, if one existed at all, was too fragile to bear the weight of overseer eyes or mistress speculation. Dinner in the big house unfolded with its usual performance. Polished silver, murmured conversation, polite smiles concealing tensions thick as molasses. Eliza stood behind the mistress's chair, refilling glasses, collecting dishes, moving silently through the room like a shadow. Talk of politics filled the air, discussions of railroads and tariffs and the necessary discipline required during turbulent times. Words floated like poison and sugar, sweetened by civility but deadly at their core. The master laughed at a comment about northern agitation, confident in the endurance of his world, and in that moment Eliza felt a clarity settle within her. These men believed themselves surrounded by order, yet their order was built on tinder, dried hatred, brittle pride, and fear disguised as authority. Fire did not simply destroy, it revealed what structures were hollow. That night, once chores were finished and the house quieted, Eliza sat alone again at her window. But her loneliness had changed, no longer a hollow ache but a sharpening blade. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean but heavy with humidity. And through the darkness she could see faint lanterns in the quarters, tiny beacons of endurance scattered across the night. Somewhere distant, a whippoorwill cried, its call mournful yet defiant. She pressed her fingertips to the wood of the window frame, feeling the grain, imagining how flame would run through such fibers, hungry and pure. She had not yet chosen her moment, but she was no longer drifting inside fate. A new resolve coiled within her, patient as embers beneath ash. Fire did not begin with chaos. It began with intention, with stillness, with breath held before the spark. Eliza closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, tasting the faint sweetness of char still lingering in the humid air from the storm-struck lightning and distant pine. She imagined futures that did not yet exist, futures carved by those who refused to bow, who carried rebellion in blood and memory. And though she did not smile, there was a shift in her posture, a quiet straightening of spine that spoke louder than any vow spoken under the plantation's great oak. Silence had been her armor. Soon action would be her voice. The night around her felt charged, as though the air itself knew that stillness was only a prelude to change. The days that followed settled into a rhythm both familiar and heavy, the kind that pressed on the chest like December fog despite the Alabama heat. Morning bells called the field hands before sunrise, iron stirring iron as shackles knocked softly in movement. And though Eliza did not labor in the rows, she felt each sound like a reminder of the weight around her own neck. The wedding's false brightness had faded into routine, its lace traded for aprons and its vows replaced by tasks whispered rather than celebrated. Yet beneath that routine, something had begun to shift. Not in the world outside, but inside her, quiet as sap rising in spring before anyone sees buds form. She moved through rooms where polished wood gleamed and portraits of stern white ancestors watched like silent judges. But she did not lower her soul even as she lowered her gaze. Every surface she touched, every command she obeyed, deepened her resolve like a seed pushing against soil, searching for the moment to break free. Whispers traveled through the quarters like threads tying hearts together, subtle and strong. Some spoke of runaways caught by patrols near the river, dragged back barefoot and bleeding. Some murmured hopeful rumors about a purchase of freedom in Louisiana, a wife saving coin by coin to rescue her husband from auction. Others whispered about fires far off, Barns burned mysteriously near Selma and Mobile, hints that rage could take form when pushed to its limit. But most held their tongues in daylight, fearing ears hidden behind doors and walls. Fear was as constant as breath in the enslaved world. Yet it could not erase the small sparks carried in glances and nods, the secret knowledge that survival itself was a quiet rebellion, and sometimes quiet sharpened into flame. Thomas worked in the carpentry shop from dawn to dusk, repairing window frames, shaping furniture, tending to wagons that carried cotton bales to market. His hands, large and calloused, could carve smooth arcs from raw wood, but his face rarely shifted from its stoic stillness. He spoke little, even when they crossed paths in the yard or hallways, and though his eyes occasionally softened, his body always seemed wound tight, as if waiting for a blow or bracing for disappointment. Some evenings he stood far enough away that overseers would not question, yet close enough that she could sense him trying to form words he never let fall. He was not a cruel man, but he was trapped in a lattice of obedience and fear, his silence another link in a chain he had learned not to strain against. Marriage had not created intimacy. It had merely placed two souls in adjacent cages, but there were small kindnesses. Once, passing through the pantry late at night, she found a peach left discreetly near her water pitcher. No note, no word, only fruit sweet enough to sting her eyes with unexpected mercy. Another evening, when she carried heavy linens down a stairwell, she sensed him watching just long enough to make sure she did not stumble. These gestures were fragile as robin eggs, unable to protect but able to remind her she was seen in a world built to erase her. She did not confuse them with love, but she did not refuse their warmth. Sometimes survival required accepting tenderness wherever it bloomed, even if it sprouted through cracks in concrete. The plantation itself moved according to the calendar of cotton and cruelty. Cotton buds swelled green and white, overseers strode like watchful hawks, and the mistress organized gatherings with neighboring planters' wives to trade recipes, gossip, and grievances wrapped in lace. They complained of heat while sipping chilled lemonade, spoke of Christian duty while ignoring the groans from the fields, and fretted over etiquette while the world beneath them smoldered with injustice. In their presence, Eliza performed quiet obedience, her hands folding cloth, pouring tea, and arranging flowers cut from gardens she was not permitted to enjoy. She listened as they debated northern newspapers, abolitionist pamphlets smuggled through ports, and rumors of revolts in distant parishes. Their voices quivered with indignation and fear, the tremor of those clinging to a world they sensed might not remain theirs. Beneath their polished civility lay dread that one day their control would wither like leaves scorched under summer drought. One afternoon, while dusting shelves in the library, Eliza paused before a book she would never be allowed to open. Its spine read, "Fire and the Origins of Civilization," gilded letters gleaming in the dim light, and she traced the word fire with her fingertip. Fire had built empires and ended them. Fire could purify or punish. Fire did not discriminate between master's house and slave cabin. She thought of her mother's whispered wisdom, of women whose names history erased, women who stirred rebellion in ashes and lullabies. She had been raised to survive, but she had also been raised to remember that silence was not the only path through pain. Sometimes a whisper could be fuel, sometimes a song could be a spark, and sometimes the only way to reclaim a life stolen piece by piece was to turn the thief's world into tinder. A week after the wedding, punishment descended upon the plantation like sudden frost. A field hand named Abram was accused of stealing a chicken, whether true or invented as excuse mattered little, and the overseer dragged him to the whipping post before sunrise. The sound of leather striking flesh tore through the air, each crack echoing across cotton rows and kitchen walls, reaching even the nursery where white children slept peacefully beneath embroidered quilts. Eliza stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, hands trembling as she gripped a pitcher, hearing Abram's cries muffled by a rag forced between his teeth. The punishment was not only for him, it was a reminder for all. Pain used as language, body used as warning, blood used as ink in the plantation's ledger of power. When the whipping ended, Abram was carried away by two men, his back a map of agony, and the overseer wiped sweat from his brow with casual satisfaction. Eliza's stomach churned, not only with sorrow but with certainty. Violence bred violence, not in the hearts of the oppressed but in the structures of those who believed themselves untouchable. Fire was not destruction. It was consequence. She turned away from the window, unable to watch any longer, yet unable to forget. The image fused itself into her memory like a brand, fueling a resolve she did not speak aloud. Pain demanded witness, and witness demanded response, even if that response took root slowly, like roots burrowing unseen. That evening, in the privacy of a washroom corner, she found her mother folding cloth with deliberate care. The older woman's face was composed, but her eyes carried storms. Without looking up, she spoke low enough that only Eliza could hear. "Keep your thoughts hidden. Fire burns both ways." The warning was not scolding. It was love sharpened by experience. Eliza nodded, though her heart beat louder than caution. She knew fire was danger, but silence too could kill. She wondered whether her mother feared the world outside or feared losing a daughter to hope. Sometimes hope was sharper than despair, and mothers who had survived decades knew the cost of sharp things in the hands of those not permitted to wield them. Night fell heavy that week, each evening thick with cicada song and restless heat. The moon waxed brighter, reflecting off the fields like a lantern held by heaven itself, watching, waiting. Eliza lay awake in her small room, listening to distant hymns drifting from the quarters, voices rising soft and steady. They sang not for the ears of masters, but for their own spirits, each note a rope tying them to ancestors across oceans, each harmony a vow to endure. The melody wrapped around her like a shroud and a shield, and she whispered the words under her breath, a secret prayer stitched in grief and grit. She did not ask for forgiveness or mercy. She asked for strength, and strength settled into her bones like marrow. A few nights later, while sweeping the front hall after the household slept, she noticed a book left open on a side table. Treatises on Natural Philosophy. A phrase caught her eye before she could look away. Combustion is transformation. Matter displaced, not erased. The sentence lodged in her mind. Transformation, not erasure. Fire did not simply end, it remade. She stood motionless a moment, broom braced in her hands, staring at that page as if the words had been written for her alone. Then, before daring eyes or fate could notice, she closed the book and returned to her task, each sweep of the broom quiet but charged, as though cleaning ash that did not yet exist. The next morning, she rose before the bells. The sky was deep indigo, stars fading, the world holding its breath between dark and dawn. She stepped onto the back porch and inhaled cool air tinged with clay and magnolia. In the distance, smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, ordinary and harmless, yet to her it looked like a promise. She felt neither fear nor calm, only readiness. Fire did not begin with flames. It began with knowing, and she knew. It began with knowing, and she knew. The fourth week after the wedding dawned with air so thick it clung to skin like damp cloth, a heat that seemed born not just from summer but from some deeper fever in the land itself, a rising pressure that pressed on lungs and tempers alike. Cicadas screamed before sunrise, restless and relentless, as if even insects could feel an undercurrent shifting beneath the surface of ordered plantation routine. Eliza woke with her pulse already racing, though no nightmare had stirred her and no sound had startled her. It was simply the sensation of a truth ripening inside her, growing weight like fruit before the fall. She moved quietly, her bare feet brushing cool floorboards, the scent of last night's rain lingering as the world prepared again for heat and labor, and the performance of obedience. Her body went through its motions, dress, wrap, braid, step, but her mind was no longer merely enduring. It was planning. Before the house fully woke, she slipped out to the side porch under the guise of shaking linens, though the cloth in her hands remained folded. From this vantage, she could see the quarters stirring, lanterns flickering inside cabins while women tied children's hair, and men stretched weary limbs before being driven to the fields. Smoke curled from breakfast fires, merging with morning mist, and voices rose in soft murmurs, prayers, instructions, warnings whispered to children too young to understand why silence was sometimes the only armor they had. The cool moment before the overseer's whistles felt fragile, like a glass sphere suspended in air, and Eliza held on to that stillness, storing it inside her the way one stores breath before leaping into deep water. Voices from inside the house broke the quiet, the mistress instructing a maid on seating arrangements for a visiting preacher, rumored to arrive that afternoon. It was always thus. The louder the world whispered about sin and violence, the louder plantation owners declared their righteousness, inviting clergy to bless chains with scripture and praise discipline as divine order. The preacher would speak of duty and patience, of suffering rewarded in heaven, all while sipping sweet tea brought by those living in imposed misery. Eliza imagined the words like smoke curling from a burning page, pious phrases masking brutality, moral language shielding rot. She wondered whether he ever looked into the eyes of those who served him and saw the cost of the comfort he enjoyed, or whether he had built walls inside himself as thick as brick to keep conscience locked away where no sermon could reach it. By mid-morning, she was assigned to the kitchen garden, clipping herbs and gathering vegetables for supper preparations. The sun beat hard even then, beads of sweat forming along her neck and dampening the muslin at her collar. As she knelt in soil rich and dark, she felt the earth cool beneath her hands, grounding her more deeply than any prayer uttered in the house's ornate parlor. Soil remembered. Soil held stories of footsteps fleeing in desperation, of babies born in secret beneath moon-hung branches, of blood spilled in punishment, of seeds planted by hands that never signed their names yet fed generations. She brushed dirt from a sprig of thyme and breathed its scent sharp and living, and for a moment felt almost whole, as though her body were rooted in something older than chains. A shadow crossed over her. She looked up to see Ruth standing a few paces away, a basket in hand, expression steady but eyes alert. Ruth did not speak. She didn't need to. Her gaze flicked once toward the big house, then to the smokehouse, then to Eliza's hands hovering above the earth. A subtle conversation passed between them without a word. Recognition, concern, a warning that paths chosen in silence could lead to storms not just for one, but for many. Eliza lowered her eyes again, not out of submission, but acknowledgement. Ruth lingered a breath longer, then moved on, her hips swaying with the slow strength of a woman who had carried pain and endurance in equal measure. After midday chores, heat thick as molasses in air, she was called to assist in the sewing room where the mistress and two visiting ladies worked at embroidery hoops and spoke of town matters with sweet smiles and sharpened tongues. They pricked fabric with smooth needles, stitching flowers they had never tended and vines they had never pruned, each thread a symbol of cultured womanhood. Yet their conversation drifted, as it often did, toward warnings, slave patrol incidents, rumors of abolitionist literature smuggled in cotton bales, the story of a woman in Mississippi who had set fire to a cane shed before being caught and corrected. They shook their heads with practiced sorrow, lamenting the unruly spirits that led to such destruction, never acknowledging the kindling they themselves stacked every time they ignored suffering at their feet. The mistress, seeing Eliza's posture perfectly still, mistook quiet for meekness. She spoke gently, almost fondly, as one might speak to a favorite possession, praising Eliza's newly bestowed marital discipline, suggesting that God favored orderly homes, both white and black. But beneath the compliment lurked threat. Order meant obedience, obedience meant silence, and silence meant surrender. Eliza responded with the calm face she had mastered, nodding once, yet inside she traced each syllable like a wick leading toward a future flame. They believed control eternal. They believed fear would hold forever. They believed a woman bound in union could not also bind herself to uprising. Near sundown, as golden light slanted across cotton fields and the sky bruised purple and rose, the preacher arrived in his fine coat, dust brushed off before stepping from his carriage as though earth itself might taint his holiness. He shook hands with the master, offered blessings over iced punch, and praised the plantation's apparent order while servants stood silent in the doorway. His voice rolled smooth as honeyed butter, sanctifying hierarchy, justifying cruelty as divine stewardship. He spoke of Eve's obedience, of Sarah's patience, of Mary's acceptance, never mentioning women who survived by resisting, never acknowledging how faith could live, even in hearts that refused to bow. Eliza watched him from the corner of the parlor, expression unreadable. He blessed the table where she laid plates each night, yet he never looked into her eyes long enough to see she carried a scripture older than his, carved in survival, whispered through bondage, powered by a God who did not build cages. After the guests retired, after hymns of submission faded into night silence, Eliza slipped briefly into the yard, drawn by the sound of soft singing rising from the quarters. The night air held hints of honeysuckle and wood smoke, and voices floated in harmony, low and steady, a heartbeat under the stars. She sat near the edge of the vegetable patch, hidden by the dark, and listened. The song spoke of Jordan rivers and promised lands, of rising and crossing and breaking free. Not rebellion shouted in open defiance, but rebellion breathed in hope too deep to drown. Her chest ached, not with sorrow but with certainty. The world could press and punish and preach, but there lived a place inside her no whip or wedding vow could reach. And that place was growing. She returned inside when the lantern on the porch guttered low. The hall smelled faintly of beeswax and roasted corn, floor still warm beneath bare feet. She passed the library door and paused when she saw it cracked open, lamplight spilling out. Inside, Thomas sat alone at the table, elbows on knees, hands clasped, face drawn tight in thought. He looked older in lamplight, worry shadowing his jaw. His shoulders slumped with weight no muscle could lift. When he sensed her presence, he straightened, eyes flicking to hers with a mixture of concern and warning, as if he too felt something brewing, something dangerous, something not easily contained. For a suspended second, neither spoke. He looked like a man wanting to reach across a distance he could not bridge, and she felt a pull to acknowledge that longing. But then his gaze hardened, not in anger but in fear. Fear for her, fear for himself, fear for everyone whose life could be shattered by one spark, however righteous. She lowered her eyes and moved past, slow and controlled. He did not call after her. In her room, she closed the door gently and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, palms on her knees, breathing steady. The house creaked around her, old wood shifting like bones settling in sleep. Somewhere outside, a lone owl called low and mournful. Eliza stared at her hands, hands that cleaned floors and laid tables, hands that had smoothed her mother's hair and held cold iron shackles during childhood punishments, hands that now shook not with fear but anticipation. A candle flickered on the table beside her, flame slender but fierce, dancing without apology. She watched it, mesmerized. Fire moved like breath. Fire did not ask permission. She reached out slowly, not to extinguish it, but to feel its heat hover just above her skin. This was not violence, it was possibility. A reminder that no matter how thick the walls, how tight the noose of control, there existed an element no man could fully command. She withdrew her hand, heartbeat steady. She withdrew her hand, heartbeat steady. Outside, thunder murmured on the horizon again, distant but real. Storm coming, or perhaps storm answering. She lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling beams, and exhaled once, long and measured. She did not yet know the day or hour, only that she was moving toward it step by quiet step, like a fuse burning slow in the dark. Night fell heavier in the 5th week than any before, not merely dark but weighted, as if the sky itself pressed down on the land, thick with unspoken promises and gathering rupture. Clouds moved low and fast, moon-veiled, stars smothered in a blanket of restless wind. Even the crickets seemed cautious, their songs subdued, replaced at intervals by the distant crack of branches in woods that bordered the fields, like bones snapping under the footfall of fate. Eliza lay awake long before dawn touched the horizon, eyes open in the blackness, pulse steady yet sharpened, aware of the hum beneath her ribs, no longer just thought, not merely fear or longing, but decision condensing into form. Each breath she took felt like preparation, each blink like a measure of time closing in. In the early hours, she rose without sound. No creak from floorboards betrayed her, for she had learned the language of silence, how to move with the house rather than against it, how to step where wood was strong, where nails did not protest. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders against the chill and stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle like dew on skin. She thought of her mother, who once whispered to her that freedom began not with running feet, but with a mind no longer willing to bow. At the time, Eliza had been too frightened to understand. Now, standing in the pale stillness before servants stirred, she felt that truth like a river deep within, gaining force, no longer contained by banks carved by others. She walked toward the kitchen, though she was not yet needed there. The world was slate gray with first light, a hesitant dawn brushing edges of the horizon. The kitchen hearth still slept, embers faint and tired under ash. She crouched and fed the remnants of fire gently, dry twigs, a curl of bark, one breath then another. Flame awakened slowly, stretching fragile limbs, growing with steady hunger. She watched it rise, mesmerized, tracing each flicker with careful attention. Fire was obedient to those who understood it, patient until fed, quiet until summoned. She felt its heat graze her cheek and closed her eyes, storing the sensation like a secret blessing. Minutes passed. The rooster crowed. A door in the quarters opened, then another. Wheels squeaked as a cart rolled out for morning milking. Chains clinked faintly as field hands were roused. Even freedom of movement on this land came measured with iron punctuation. Eliza rose and began preparing the morning meal, hands moving in practiced rhythm, grinding corn, beating eggs, slicing salt pork with knife strokes that landed soft against wood. Yet beneath the quiet dance of work lived an electric undercurrent, a vibration that seemed to pulse from the earth itself. As she worked, footsteps approached. The mistress appeared in the doorway, shawl wrapped tight, eyes puffy from a night spent in plush comfort. She spoke with mild impatience, complaining of distant thunder disturbing her rest, of wind rattling shutters as though nature owed her gentleness. She did not greet Eliza, did not ask after her morning. There was no world in which such regard existed. Instead, she gave instructions for supper, for table settings, for an upcoming visit by neighbors who believed themselves guardians of Southern grace. Her voice dripped with practiced civility, a nectar sweet to those who benefited from it, poison to those forced to serve beneath its sheen. Eliza listened, head bowed but mind unbent, and responded with measured respect. Her tone betrayed nothing. Her posture revealed nothing. But inside she catalogued each instruction not as duty but as structure, shapes she could move within, patterns she could twist when the moment ripened. The mistress left satisfied, unaware that obedience sometimes mimics surrender so perfectly it becomes indistinguishable to the privileged eye. By midday, the sun burned fierce again, humidity rising like steam from the earth, field hands bent beneath it, their bodies glistening with heat and labor. Overseer's shadow cutting across rows like a blade. Eliza stood just outside the smokehouse, wiping her hands on her apron as she waited for rendered fat to drip into a tin basin. The scent of curing meat mixed with wild sage carried from the edge of the woods. Her gaze drifted toward the quarters where laundry flapped in gusty wind like flags of unspoken rebellion. She saw Ruth again, hanging sheets with brisk movements. Their eyes met. This time Ruth did not look away. She held the glance long enough to speak without voice. "Are you certain of the path you're carving? Are you ready for the weight of it?" Eliza returned the look, steady and unflinching. Not assurance, not arrogance, simply resolve. Ruth's jaw tightened and she gave the faintest nod. Not agreement, not blessing, but recognition. In the afternoon, while polishing silver and arranging linens for a supper too lavish for a world built on stolen life, Eliza heard raised voices from the master's study. Not the angry bellow of command, but the tense whisper of fear. She paused in the hallway, tray balanced in her hand, listening to fragments float through the door. News of unrest in Mississippi, whispers of a planned escape in Georgia, rumors of incendiary tools found near a barn in Louisiana. Words like danger and agitation and vigilance hung in the air. The men spoke as though the earth might erupt beneath them, as though the world owed them calm yet dared to tremble. A servant girl brushed past Eliza, trembling, eyes wide. "They scared," she whispered quickly, almost trembling with excitement disguised as dread. Eliza's jaw tightened. Fear in the oppressor was not salvation, but it was a signal, a crack in certainty, a shifting tide. That evening, rain threatened again but held itself taut in the clouds like a bowstring drawn tight. The temperature dropped by a breath, and wind slithered through magnolias, rustling blossoms not yet fallen. The household gathered for supper, laughter forced, silverware chiming against plates like brittle performance. Eliza served dishes with practiced grace. Braised pork, buttered peas, yeast rolls puffed golden. She poured wine into crystal, its deep red catching candle glow, shimmering like blood under flame. As she leaned in to refill a glass, she caught words from one of the guests, a woman visiting from Savannah, lamenting recent disturbances and praising a neighbor who had made an example of a young man accused of plotting escape. Her voice carried pride, cold and bright, recounting cruelty as though it were accomplishment. At those words, Eliza's hand stilled just a fraction, barely noticeable. But Thomas noticed. He watched her with eyes that understood more than he wished. When she stepped away, he followed with gaze heavy as a storm cloud, torn between fear and warning and something that looked like helpless respect. Later, as twilight surrendered fully to night, Eliza retreated again to the yard. The air felt electric, charged like metal before lightning. She walked slowly, steps deliberate, breathing deep the scent of approaching rain and soil warmed through the day. She reached the edge of the garden and knelt, palms pressing into earth not as servant but as daughter of it. She closed her eyes and whispered, Not prayer in the form the preacher would bless, but invocation older than his pulpit, a calling to ancestors who survived chains and fire, to spirits who carried blades in silence and courage in marrow. Behind her a door opened softly. Footsteps approached, hesitant. Thomas's voice came low, almost breaking. "Eliza." She did not look up. "Yes, sir." A long pause stretched, taut as wire. "Whatever is building in you," he began, voice frayed at the edges. "Be careful." His words were not command nor plea, but confession. Fear not for himself but for her, for all of them. She lifted her head and met his gaze. For the first time she saw no mask of ownership, no presumption of authority, only a man witnessing something he could not stop. Something righteous and dangerous and inevitable. Whatever he hoped to change with caution came too late. "I see the world," she said quietly, voice steady as stone. "And the world sees me." A flash of lightning ripped across the sky, illuminating fields, quarters, main house, all in stark white. For a moment the landscape appeared stripped of pretense, labor without disguise, wealth without innocence, suffering without silence. Thunder followed, slow and rolling, like drums in the distance calling armies not yet visible. Thomas swallowed, then retreated without another word. He understood, and understanding did nothing to save him. Eliza remained kneeling a moment longer, letting rain begin its first soft patter around her, drops striking leaves like whispered footfall. When she finally rose, she felt the shift inside her complete. Not spark, but steady flame, not question, but vow. Freedom did not always roar in its beginning. Sometimes it breathed first, low, controlled, inevitable. The storm would break soon. The sixth dawn did not come gently. It arrived as if torn from the sky, clouds cracking open with a violence that mirrored the trembling inside Eliza. Rain fell in thin, slanted lines, not yet furious but insistent, tapping against the windows and roof shingles like restless fingers. The world woke subdued, wrapped in a hush that felt less like peace and more like omen. There are storms that wash away dust and storms that carve new ground. This one felt born for reckoning. Eliza rose in darkness again, but this time her body moved with a different steel, not quiet from fear or caution, but from solemn certainty. She had crossed an inner line, foot already placed on the path, no turning back. Her hands trembled only once as she tied her apron, not from doubt, but from the magnitude of what her spirit now carried. She lit the hearth again, flame growing against the morning damp. Wood hissed softly with moisture, struggling, then yielding. As fire climbed, its reflection shimmered in her eyes. Those eyes that once dulled with endurance now sharpened with purpose. Ruth entered, shoulders hunched from wind, hair damp at the edges. She paused, watching the flame too long before speaking. "Storm brewing bigger than sky," she murmured, barely audible. Eliza did not look at her, but her voice held gravity. "Some storms come to break, some to cleanse." Ruth nodded once, slow, heavy as if the truth pressed on her bones. In the main house, footsteps stirred sluggishly. Storms unsettled the planter class. Weather threatened crops, rain meant rot and mud and delay. In truth, nature answered to no master. The mistress entered, face tight with weather irritation, dismissing the rain as inconvenience, as though the sky should consider her needs before opening. She gave orders with clipped tone, worried about guests scheduled for supper, fretting over roads softening into clay. Eliza obeyed outwardly, but inside every command weighed like tinder. The more the mistress spoke, the more Eliza's resolve smoldered, fed not by hatred alone, but by the absolute knowledge that silence was a coffin with gilded edges. By late morning, thunder rolled in low, steady cadence, and wind whipped clothes on the line with such force that one sheet tore clean at the corner. The overseer stalked across the yard, checking latches, barking warnings about barns and tools and keeping watch for trouble. His voice floated through rain, brittle with the paranoia common among those who feared an uprising more than they feared God. The enslaved moved as they always did, swift hands, bowed heads, but their glances carried stormlight. Knowing tension stretched thin across plantation boundaries like piano wire waiting to snap. Eliza carried linen from the line through wet grass and mud. Each droplet on her skin seemed cold only for a breath before her body heat absorbed it, like she burned warmer than the morning. Passing near the quarters, she saw men repairing harnesses in a lean-to, rain dripping steady behind them. Isaac, tall and scarred from punishment 2 winters past, met her gaze briefly. His eyes didn't ask questions they did not need to. There were moments in history where decisions rippled beyond the chooser, where one spark set tinder that had been drying decades. His look said he felt the shift in the air and new flames did not start themselves. By midday, the mistress announced she would not risk traveling muddy roads. Instead, she insisted the household would host unexpected company that evening, neighbors caught in the storm. "We must show hospitality even when inconvenienced," she declared, unaware of the bitter irony. Eliza nodded politely, but inside, calculations tightened. More people meant more distraction. More distraction meant more opportunity. Plans, once fluid like water, began crystallizing into shape, precise and irreversible. She felt time closing like a fist, not threatening but calling. The kitchen swelled with heat as fires roared to accommodate sudden feast preparations. Pots bubbled, bread rose, meat seasoned and seared. The air filled with aroma of herbs, smoke, and anticipation. Storm winds rattled windows, a natural percussion beneath the human clamor. Eliza worked fast but not frantic. Every movement was measured. She checked the smokehouse twice, once for supplies, once to confirm no one watched when her hand lingered near oil stored in clay jars. She touched nothing yet. Timing demanded patience. Freedom, she had learned, was not seized by impulse but carved with strategy, sharpened by suffering. In the afternoon, a hush fell, rare, heavy. Rain paused. Wind stilled. Even birds quieted, waiting. The plantation seemed suspended in breath. At that moment, an old woman from the quarters shuffled to the back porch, leaning on a cane carved from cedar. Her face a map of years and endurance, she stared at Eliza a long moment. No words passed. She simply tapped her cane twice on wood, soft, rhythmic, ancient, and turned away. Eliza's heart tightened. Some blessings came not in speech but in knowing. Evening settled without sunlight, sky bruised purple and steel. Lanterns lit early, casting long shadows across floors and fields. Guests arrived in carriages splattered with mud, escorted by nervous drivers who kept glancing into trees. They entered laughing too loud, eager to prove storm held no power over them. Arrogance swirled with perfume and cigars. Eliza moved among them silently, setting dishes, adjusting chairs, filling glasses. Her face betrayed nothing, a perfect mask forged over years. But inside, emotion surged, not rage wild and unbound, but a profound sorrow for every life stolen, a reverence for every voice silenced, and a fire fed by their memory. Thunder cracked again, closer, louder, shaking glass panes. Women gasped, men chuckled bravely. Then fell quiet when a second boom followed immediately, rolling like artillery through hills. Eliza's pulse matched the rhythm, steady and growing. She excused herself under guise of retrieving more candles and slipped into the pantry. Breath steady, hands still. She reached behind sacks of flour to a jug of lamp oil, wrapping it in cloth to silence the sound. She moved it to the kitchen hearth and placed it discreetly near logs stacked dry from summer. No flare yet, not time. Back in the hall, conversation drifted. Talk of crops, of politics, of rumors about agitators from the north stirring trouble. One man cursed abolitionists as traitors. Another bragged about new iron cuffs purchased from Mobile. Their words hung thick, sticky as molasses boiling too long. Eliza stood beside a table arranging silver. Her fingers grazed a candlestick, tracing its smooth curve. A simple gesture, yet lightning coursed through her chest. Fire answered intention. Thomas entered then, raincoat damp, eyes restless. He scanned the room until he found her. For a fleeting breath, their eyes locked. Their silent understanding deepened to something irreversible. He knew the moment was near. Fear flickered in him, not for himself, but for her fate in a world ruled by iron law. She inclined her head barely, a calm acknowledgement of what he could not stop. He stepped back, swallowed, turned away. Protection had its limits under tyranny. Night thickened. Guests called for more wine. Servants moved with practiced grace, thunder punctuated laughter that grew brittle. In a lull between lightning pulses, Eliza slipped once more to the kitchen. She knelt by the hearth, feeding logs carefully, then dipped a small brush in oil, brushing edges of kindling with slow, deliberate strokes. Not enough to flare immediately, just enough to ensure one spark would become legion. She whispered inwardly, not prayer for escape, not plea for mercy, but tribute to those who came before. Let light answer darkness, let silence burn. As she stood, the mistress entered unexpectedly, demanding more candles for the parlor. Eliza turned, calm, composed, offering a faint, humble nod. The mistress did not notice the faint sheen of oil on Eliza's fingers, nor the subtle tremor in air like tension drawn to snapping. She left as quickly as she arrived, satisfied and oblivious. The room returned to stillness, hearth breathing brighter. Eliza pressed her palm against the warm stone mantel, grounding herself. Heart steady, will firm. Outside, rain resumed in fierce sheets, drumming roof and earth like ancestral drums calling warriors in the night. Wind howled through pecan branches. Somewhere across the yard, a baby cried, then fell quiet, soothed by a mother's whispered lullaby older than the chains that bound her people. Eliza walked to the door of the kitchen and stood watching rain. The world blurred through its falling veil, lantern light flickering like stars drowning yet refusing to vanish. She felt grief and courage intertwine inside her, two rivers meeting. There would be no turning back. Silence had been burial. Fire would be testimony. Behind her, the first ember caught oil, a soft hiss, a whisper of flame licking dry wood. She did not flinch. In the parlor, laughter rose again, unaware of the reckoning footprints already walking toward them in heat and smoke. In this moment, she was neither servant nor captive. She was witness and instrument, memory and future, a vessel carrying centuries of broken chains yet waiting to be forged. Storm outside, storm inside, each answering the other. Freedom, once a dream whispered in cotton rose, now breathed at the base of her spine, rising. She closed her eyes for one heartbeat, honoring the dead, the silent, the stolen, the unborn future. Then she opened them again, gaze sharp, back straight, firelight dancing on her skin. The world behind her began to crackle. The world behind her began to crackle. The moment flame met oil, the sound was barely more than a sigh, quiet, intimate, as though the fire whispered its first breath in reverence. But heat grows like a truth long denied. Slowly at first, then with force that refuses to be swallowed. A curl of smoke rose in the kitchen, thin as a hair, wavering as if uncertain before thickening with intent. Eliza stood still, spine straight, chin lifted, watching not with panic but with solemn recognition, as though witnessing a birth she herself midwifed. This was not rage without purpose. It was justice wearing flame as its final garment. She moved toward the dining room, steady, calm, candle tray in hand, posture dignified against the storm outside and the one she had lit inside. Laughter still floated from the table like artificial perfume, thick with self-satisfaction and ignorance. A guest boasted about a new steam-powered gin soon to multiply his yield, while another glass raised, declared plantation life the divine arrangement of mankind. Their words clanged against Eliza's senses like brittle metal, hollow and ugly. They did not see the smoke snaking under the kitchen door. They did not smell the faint burn beneath rosemary and ham. They believed the world theirs to command, even as its foundation began to crack beneath them. Eliza placed fresh candles onto the sideboard, flame steady, eyes lowered. To any watching, she was dutiful still, poised, obedient. But inside, resolve blazed beyond reach of fear or hesitation. The mistress noticed nothing but her own worries, prattling about linens dampening in the humidity and how storms were so unladylike. Thomas, however, caught the faintened shift in air first. His nostrils flared as he inhaled, gaze snapping subtly toward the kitchen corridor. His throat tightened. Smoke whispered along the ceiling then, a gray seam tracing molding like ink bleeding through paper. His wineglass paused mid-air. His eyes sought Eliza's across the room. She did not look back. She did not need to. In the set of her shoulders and the quiet solidity of her breath, he recognized the moment had arrived, as unstoppable as thunder after lightning. It began slowly to them. One woman at the far end of the table sniffed and asked if the cook had burned something. Then a faint crackle echoed, wood shifting as heat tested its old bones. A servant boy froze in the doorway, eyes widening, then darted away to alert the overseer. Chairs scraped across hardwood as men rose, confused at first, irritation overtaking concern. Only when heat pulsed through the floorboards like a heartbeat did fear sharpen their voices, transforming certainty to dread. A guest shouted for water, another for buckets, but panic moves slower than fire, and pride stumbles where humility might run. The mistress shrieked, clutching pearls as though ivory could save her. Men rushed to the kitchen only to be beaten back by smoke now rolling heavy, rising with purpose. Flames licked door edges hungry, claiming space never meant to belong to those who suffered in its shadows. Eliza stepped back from the dining room edge, watching chaos unfold like a long-awaited scripture. Servants scrambled, torn between orders and instinct, some frozen by terror taught generation through generation. Fire meant punishment, and even surviving it could be seen as guilt. She moved gracefully amid frenzy, untouched by its confusion, not frantic like those who feared loss of property, not trembling like those unsure which loyalty might keep them alive. Her purpose did not waver. Smoke unfurled across ceiling beams, a dark crown forming above gilded portraits and polished mirrors. Cries rose, disbelief, anger, fear, an orchestra of a system finally hearing itself break. Outside, wind screamed through pecan branches, rain slashed earth, and thunder answered the crackling inside with holy fury. The enslaved in quarters lifted their heads toward Plantation house glow turning orange through storm-blurred windows. They did not cheer. They did not rush forward. They simply watched, breath held, hearts pounding. Some whispered prayers, others held children tight. A few touched the earth, palm pressed flat, grounding themselves to soil that had consumed sweat and blood. Firelight reflected in their eyes like memory and prophecy combined. Thomas grabbed Eliza's arm suddenly, pulling her toward the back door, voice harsh with fear. "Come," he hissed, more plea than command. "You cannot stay." She turned to him then, not startled, not resisting, but studying his face, the confusion, the sorrow, the helpless respect trapped between the world he owned and the truth he finally saw. "I do not run from what I set free," she answered softly, but he held tighter, hands trembling. "They will kill you. You know they will." She looked at his fingers on her skin, then at the burning house behind him, and something in her expression softened. Not affection, not regret, but acknowledgement of a soul who tried to see through a cage but was still inside it. "You cannot save me," she said, "but I do not need saving." He faltered, breath unsteady. Outside shouts grew. Men ordering horses, demanding tools, thrusting blame as though blame could smother flame. She stepped back from him slowly, gently breaking his grip as one who releases something already lost. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Tell no one what you know. That can be your part." His face crumpled. Shame, fear, grief, all without language. But he did not call after her. She slipped into rain like a whisper returning to wind. Storm pelted her, soaking dress, hair plastered, shawl heavy. She walked without hurry, feeling mud cling to her feet, roots beneath ground trembling with thunder. Behind her, the plantation house roared louder, flame now devouring walls, glass shattering like lies breaking. Screams rose sharper. The mistress stumbled out under escort, dress hem singed, face streaked, shrieking accusations at servants, at elements, at fate. A guest tripped on steps and fell into mud, suit ruined, dignity ravaged. Someone called for the overseer, someone else for guns, for ropes, for retribution. Eliza did not turn. Her breath was steady, each inhale tasting rain and smoke and life unfettered. At the tree line she paused, looking at quarters silhouetted in firelight. Ruth stood there, children clinging to her skirts, rain slicking her face. Her eyes locked on Eliza's with something like awe tinged with dread. Freedom is never birthed without cost. Ruth saw both sides of that truth in one burning night. Eliza raised her chin, not farewell, not triumph, but recognition. Ruth dipped her head once, solemn blessing between women who knew that silence had never been safety, only slow death. A crack, roof beam surrendering, thunder not of sky but collapsing structure. Men ran buckets in frantic chain, voices hoarse but fire fed on dry timbers soaked in history and rage. Horses screamed in stables, overseer yelling commands that wind and flame refused to hear. Rain fell harder, hammering earth, but fire danced defiantly, refusing to be quenched by anything less than completion. Eliza entered the woods, feet sinking into softened soil, branches whipping around her like hands pushing her forward. The forest swallowed her, shadows deep, roots knotted like ancestral fingers guiding her gait. She did not run. Running was desperation. She walked like one who had already crossed into another world. Behind her, a dynasty built on stolen breath cracked, groaned, and began to fall inward on itself. She found shelter beneath a cypress where rain could not pierce fully. Where earth rose slightly forming natural cradle, there she knelt, breathing hard for the first time, body shaking not from fear but from enormity. Firelight flickered faint through trees, dimming as rain and collapse battled heat. Smoke drifted, carrying with it voices of those who suffered and those who inflicted, indistinguishable in ash. Eliza pressed her hand to soil, feeling vibration of storm, of history, of future. No chains clinked. No orders barked. Only rain, wind, and her own heartbeat. She thought of children unborn who would one day speak freely. She thought of women bent over fields who would lift heads higher. She thought of men bruised by whips who would one day walk roads without bowing. Flames died slowly behind her, smoke rising as monument to truth finally spoken in brightest tongue. She did not cry. Tears felt too small for night this vast. At last, as dawn bled pale into storm's retreat, birds dared a tentative call, the first fragile note of day after reckoning. Eliza rose. Clothes heavy, limbs tired, but spirit unbroken, reborn through fire. She stepped forward into woods, into future uncertain and dangerous, yet hers. Behind the plantation smoldered, a carcass of a world that believed silence was eternal. It was not silence that saved her. It was fire that gave her voice. And as she walked deeper into trees, morning broke at her back, brushing ash-stained sky with gold, as if even the sun now rose through smoke to find a world new forged by courage and flame. She did not look back again. Freedom does not return to ruins. It moves forward, carrying embers for those still waiting in shadows until all darkness learns the name of fire.